Hey folks, this is Alan from Important Fun, here with another fun, super professional looking Google Slides presentation talking about Dungeons and Dragons and other role-playing games. So last week I talked about building a campaign arc using goals and obstacles, and this week I want to kind of go a couple levels lower by talking about how I design one individual D&D session. So this is going to be fairly specific to Dungeons and Dragons, mostly because I think of D&D as very much a combat-oriented game. I know that's not how everyone plays it all the time, but I do think if you are going to do a more non-combat-y game, there's just other, options that are more suited for that. And D&D is clearly designed for combat. So what do I mean when I say a session? And I'll also sometimes say an adventure, or maybe even the old school like a dungeon or a mini dungeon. And basically, going back to what I talked about last week, a session is, a self-contained period of time where you sit down with your friends at the table or online and you play, a few hours, play Dungeons and Dragons. But the most important thing is that you're accomplishing a goal. This might be a big goal for a session that kind of ends a campaign arc, or it might be a more minor goal. But I try and make every session have some sort of goal, overcoming some sort of obstacle, even if that's as minor as, hey, we moved through one level of this dungeon and now we're one step closer to whatever it is we're doing. I shoot personally for around 2 to 3 hours, maybe around 3, a little over. If I get to 3 hours in a session of D&D, that's when I start kicking things really into high gear as far as trying to move things along, wrap things up. Some people play for longer, some people don't. Again, I really like having a planned, self-contained session as opposed to running, say, like Dungeon of the Mad Mage, where you've got all these different levels, and it might take, 2 or 3 sessions to get through one level, and you don't really have an endpoint in there in mind. So to plan for 2 or 3 hours, I like to have around 3 serious combat encounters. These are combat encounters that the Dungeon Master's Guide would qualify as in the medium to hard to deadly range. I usually do 1 hard to deadly for the kind of climactic scene, and then 2 medium to hard ones to kind of lead up to that. Again, I do this mostly for D&D because it's a very tactical combat focused game. However, I do like to have 2 to 4 non-combat encounters planned out as well. And when I say combat and non-combat, neither of these, you don't want to get with either of these the mindset that it has to be combat or it can't be combat. It's however you want to put, again, obstacles in the player's way. Now with what I call combat encounters, these are obstacles that are going to be very tempting or very obvious to solve with combat. And with the non-combat encounters, those are obstacles that are going to be difficult to solve with combat. But you want to do that to vary things up, as I'll talk about in a minute. Another somewhat specific to D&D thing that I like to prep is 1 or 2 random encounters. Now this is a proud tradition going back to the early days of Dungeons and Dragons that for a while I wasn't big on. The idea of a fully random encounter in a more story-based or narrative-based campaign didn't really make sense to me. Now I like them mostly as a tool to kind of adjust the pace as needed. If I think we're, getting too close to the end, and it's only been like an hour or so, you've got something prepared to throw in there. or if the players are just getting sort of off topic, whether out of character or in character, they kind of don't know how to proceed. This is something that you can throw in there to liven things up, to like bring the tension back up and get people back where they are. And then you can have, it's a good clue delivery service if the players are absolutely lost as to where they might be able to go to resolve this obstacle. Sometimes throwing in a random encounter, you can afterwards be like, oh, and then they've got, such and such note that says, go here, dummies. Maybe not that. So the shape of a session is really important. And this is where, like I was mentioning, combat and non-combat encounters. I try to, if at all possible, kind of make it so that there's a high probability that, you'll have a combat encounter and then things will kind of chill out and you've got a non-combat encounter to break things up, and then another combat encounter, getting harder as time goes on throughout the session as the players lose resources. They spend their spell slots and healing surges, and it just combat tends to get tedious when you just run combat after combat after combat. Some players will get bored too if you have like just talking to NPCs for an hour and a half. Some players like that. Some players like just combat. But that's why I try and sandwich it together so that hopefully everyone gets a little bit of what they want and nobody has to deal with the same thing over and over and over again. So when I'm planning an adventure, planning a session, there's a particular order I usually go about doing this. I start with the finish. This is partially because, how I mentioned, on the campaign level, I'm coming up with some sort of obstacle for each session. So if I've already got that, that's probably going to be my finish, is resolving that obstacle, whatever that may mean. Then I'm going to go back to the beginning. This may be kind of easy because you know where you left off last session, but you want to start strong, come up with something to, a reason why the players or the player characters are going into this situation that you've kind of created for them. And then once you've got those two endpoints figured out, you can move on to the middle, what the obstacles are going to be that prevent players from just going straight to resolving and achieving their goal for the whole session. Once I've gotten all that, sort of fill in the little gaps, maybe throw in a few minor rooms of interest, things that don't really take up much time, figure out random encounters, that sort of thing. So speaking of encounters, I mentioned this in a previous blog post that you might want to check out if you're interested in this, because it goes a lot more into the math of everything. I have a really big spreadsheet I made with all the various, not every combination of monsters that you could throw at people for every level, but pretty much within guidelines. Personally, when planning encounters, I try and make every encounter work for and be balanced for a party of 3 characters, 4 characters, or 5 or more characters. I do this because sometimes I run games where I don't know how many people are going to show up, and it may be easier to just have that character wait outside in the wagon, wait back at town or whatever, and run the session with fewer players. This also helps me, so I usually have either a whole bunch of smaller monsters or one sort of more powerful creature and then their little minions. Planning things this way also helps me sort of avoid the temptation of just being like, oh, according to the book, this level 4 party can take on a CR6 creature. I find that those sorts of encounters don't work as well as a slightly weaker creature and then some minions. Usually 4 player characters versus one powerful monster, the action economy just works against that monster so much. It's really hard to balance. So you end up throwing an even harder monster, and then they're one-shotting characters in one hit. It doesn't balance as well. I find that encounters are actually a lot more fun if you have one big bad and then some helpers. So that's kind of how I balance these encounters. And again, I've got the 3 different tiers as explained in the Dungeon Master's Guide: the hard to deadly, medium to hard, and easy to medium. Some of my non-combat encounters, I will kind of balance as an easy to medium encounter. Same thing for the random encounters, because those aren't really supposed to be testing the players. They're more to as a pacing tool. And that's about it. Obviously I didn't talk much about dramatic tension, but really I think most of what I went over in the goals and obstacles video last week can kind of be applied to this. You're just doing it on a much smaller scale, thinking about in terms of minutes and hours instead of weeks and months of game time. So hopefully that makes sense. There's more info on my blog if you want to kind of read that at importantfun.com/blog. Or if you have any questions, you can leave them here on YouTube or tweet at me at importantfun. Thank you very much for watching once again. Bye.